3 years after leaving a small English colony behind, John White finally returned to Roanoke Island. But the people he had left there were gone. More than 100 men, women, and children had disappeared. There were no bodies, no clear signs of a battle. Only 2 strange clues remained. CRO, carved into a tree, and Croatoan, carved into the settlement. And more than 4 centuries later, we still don't know exactly what happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke. This is the story of one of history's most enduring mysteries. The late 1500s, England was trying to establish a permanent presence in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh supported English expeditions to North America, hoping to create an English colony. Earlier attempts had already taken place on Roanoke Island. But in 1587, Raleigh supported a new and more ambitious expedition. This time, the goal was different. The settlers were supposed to establish a permanent English settlement farther north, around the Chesapeake Bay. The expedition was led by John White, an artist and mapmaker who had been appointed governor. And this was not simply an expedition of soldiers. There were families, there were women, there were children. In total, 117 colonists were part of the 1587 settlement. They sailed from England in April 1587. But their journey did not go according to plan. When they reached the coast of North America, they stopped at Roanoke Island. Roanoke was supposed to be only a temporary stop. The plan was to continue north toward the Chesapeake Bay. But their pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to take them farther north. Summer was already advancing, and the colonists were left on Roanoke Island. On July 22, 1587, John White and the settlers arrived at the island. They began repairing the buildings and fortifications left from the earlier English settlement. But almost immediately, problems appeared. The colonists needed food. They were in an unfamiliar environment, and relations between the English and some indigenous communities were already tense. Soon, a colonist named George Howe was killed. The English retaliated, but in the confusion, they attacked a Croatoan community rather than the group they intended to target. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Then, something happened that gave the struggling colony a moment of hope. On August 18, 1587, John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to a baby girl. Her name was Virginia Dare. She became the first English child known to have been born in the New World. But the colony still needed supplies, and John White knew that the settlers could not depend on what they had with them forever. So he made a difficult decision. He would return to England. He would collect supplies and support, and then come back to Roanoke. The plan was supposed to be temporary, but it would change everything. John White left Roanoke in late August 1587. He expected to return quickly. Instead, England was pulled into a major conflict with Spain. The Spanish Armada threatened England in 1588, and English ships were needed for the defense of the country. Because of the war, White could not simply return to Roanoke. Months passed. Then more time passed. The people he had left behind were still across the Atlantic, and White had no way of knowing what had happened to them. Eventually, in 1590, White finally found a way to return. He sailed with a group of privateers who were heading toward the Caribbean. After a long journey, he reached the Outer Banks. On August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dare's birth, John White returned to Roanoke Island. He expected to find his family. Instead, he found an abandoned settlement. There were no colonists, no clear signs of a battle, and no bodies. The houses were gone or had been dismantled. The settlement appeared to have been abandoned. But White soon discovered something that changed the mystery completely. There was a word carved into a tree. CRO. Then, at the palisades surrounding the settlement, another word had been carved. Croatoan. For John White, this was an important clue. Before he left the colony, White had agreed with the settlers that if they had to leave Roanoke, they should carve the name of their destination into a tree or another visible location. And if they were forced to leave because of danger, they were supposed to include a particular sign. White did not find that sign. Instead, he found the word Croatoan. Croatoan referred to both a people and a place in the region. The Croatoan people lived on an island, now generally identified with Hatteras Island. John White therefore believed the colonists had probably moved there. Perhaps they had joined the Croatoan community. Perhaps they had relocated there to survive. For the first time, White had a possible explanation. So he tried to reach Croatoan. But once again, the weather interfered. A storm forced the ships away from the coast. White never reached Croatoan, and he never found his daughter, his granddaughter, or the other colonists. From that moment on, the fate of the Lost Colony became a mystery. But what actually happened? There is no confirmed answer. Over the centuries, historians and researchers have suggested several theories. One possibility is that the colonists moved south toward Croatoan and lived with indigenous communities. There is some evidence of European objects from the period on Hatteras Island. But these objects cannot conclusively prove that the entire Roanoke colony settled there. Another possibility is that some of the colonists moved toward the Chesapeake Bay. That was, after all, their original destination. Later accounts from the Jamestown period contain stories about earlier English settlers. But these accounts are not enough to prove exactly what happened to the Roanoke colonists. There are also theories that the settlers split into different groups and moved to different locations. Other theories have suggested conflict, disease, starvation, storms, or even a Spanish attack. But none of these explanations has been conclusively proven. And this is where the story of Roanoke becomes especially fascinating. We have clues, we have written records, we have archaeological discoveries. But we do not have the final piece of the puzzle. We know the settlers were at Roanoke in 1587. We know John White left to obtain supplies. We know war with Spain delayed his return. We know that when he finally returned in 1590, the settlement was abandoned. We know that CRO was carved into a tree. We know that Croatoan was carved into the palisade. And we know that John White never discovered what happened to the people he left behind. Everything beyond these facts becomes uncertain. That is why the Roanoke Colony is not simply a story about people who disappeared. It is a story about how history can leave us with fragments, but not always the complete picture. The settlers may have moved. They may have joined another community. They may have divided into different groups. Or future discoveries may one day reveal something we still do not know. But after more than 4 centuries, there is still no definitive explanation for the fate of the Lost Colony. John White returned to England without his family. He never saw them again. And the people of Roanoke disappeared from the historical record. But they left behind one mysterious message, a single word carved into wood: Croatoan. And that word has kept one question alive for more than 400 years. What became of the lost colony of Roanoke?